All right, let's kick it off. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's live digital workshop together with Owens Corning. We're really excited for today's conversation because it is about goal setting and the importance of having really bold goals that are based on evidence and science. So really using a data-driven approach to help establish goals, to help continue to meet those goals and track progress on those goals. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by two experts in the field who bring a shared but also unique perspective to the conversation. Thank you for joining us, Josh Strake, who is Sustainability Analyst at Owens Corning, and Julie Childers, who is the Director of Corporate Sustainability at Owens Corning. And for those of you that may not be too familiar with Owens Corning, it is a Fortune 500 company that produces roofing, insulation, and composites. So definitely a product that you've probably encountered various times. And we're thrilled to have you here. So thank you, Josh and Julie, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. I could just add a little more about Owens Corning. I always tell people who I say I work for Owens Corning and they're like, who's that? And I say, you know, the pink fluffy insulation, and everyone gets that. We make the pink stuff. We're also a global enterprise. In 2019, we had about $7.2 billion in sales. We have 19,000 employees and we're in 33 countries around the world. And like Susie said, we do roofing, insulation, and glass fiber composites. And we develop, market, and manufacture those products that we think help make the world a better place. Each of our businesses is a world leader in delivering insulation and roofing products to keep homes, buildings, and the people in them safe, comfortable, and dry. We also produce glass fiber in composite materials that's used in things like automobiles, bridges, and wind energy blades, and personal electronics. And we like to think that we're, a company that's global in scope and also human in scale. And sustainability is a huge part of how we do that and how we view ourselves as a global citizen and as a corporate citizen. And yeah, our 2030 goals and the materiality assessment that helped inform them were a really big undertaking in the past year and a half or so, and we're thrilled to talk about them today. Great,
thank you. Yeah, and the pink fluffy stuff, that's a really easy way to remember it. And you also have the Pink Panther as your main icon, right? The MGM Pink Panther. So we should have put that on the screen here, but for those of you that don't know it, you can look online and see it. And for everyone who does not know me, my name is Susie Kadis. I'm VP of Brand and Business Development at DataMoran. We'll talk a little bit more about what DataMoran is if you're not familiar, but before we do, just wanted to give a quick overview of general housekeeping. As you may have realized, you're muted. That's just to ensure, prime audio quality for our discussion today. But we do want this to be an interactive conversation. It really is a dialogue today. So get your questions ready, use the Zoom chat box as some of you have already done. Feel free to tweet your questions as well to DataMoran AI. I've got some colleagues monitoring that. We'll look at the questions throughout the conversation and ask the panelists. The panelists can also see your questions. We'll have a dedicated Q&A time at the end of today's conversation, but we'll monitor and make sure we answer your questions throughout. Any technical questions or difficulties, you can chat us on Zoom. I have a colleague monitoring that, but you can also email us at marketing@datamoran.com. The event is being recorded, so we will share the recording once we get through the conversation in about a couple of weeks. All right, so before we dive in and really hear from our experts, quick introduction to DataMoran. So DataMoran is the market leader in external risk management. It's the only software in the market that identifies and monitors external risks and opportunities, including environmental, social, and corporate governance issues, or ESG and sustainability issues. So the platform is fully automated, it's digital, it's data-driven, which means that anyone who uses DataMoran, like Josh and Julie, have a capability to look at these insights in-house at all moments in time. With DataMoran, we really work across a variety of industries. So these are just some of the companies that we work with. As you'll see soon in the live demonstration, there are ways that you can filter the data to really meet the criteria that you're looking at. Owens Corning, I think did something quite interesting with DataMoran and their materiality process. They did a global materiality analysis, but also regional materiality analyses. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But they actually have a materiality white paper, which is just brilliant material and education for anyone who's interested in learning more about their process and how they actually went through a data-driven science-based materiality approach that helped to inform their goals, but also helped to establish materiality on a global scale and a regional scale. So the companies that we work with, like Owens Corning, use DataMoran for materiality analysis, but also external risk analysis, ongoing issues monitoring. We'll talk a little bit about that and show you how you can do that. I think 2020 is just a prime example of how quickly certain issues can become more or less significant for a company. So we'll show you some examples there. But also it's a very interactive platform with lots of visualizations. So there's a lot of ways that you can use the insights for engagement with executives and boards, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. So before we jump into the conversation, why are we here talking about goal setting? This is potentially obvious for some of you, but just to reiterate, I think there are three main points. One is it really, helps to articulate your company vision, but also inform strategy. Beyond that, it helps to hold the company, the management, the board to various stakeholders, investors, employees, NGOs, whichever stakeholders may be interested and invested in your business. But I think more particular is, strategic goals on ESG issues or sustainability issues help to minimize risk, as well as create business value, not just now, so not just in the short term, but also in the future, in the long term. And really the best strategic goals are bold and science-based. And we'll talk about that with Julie and Josh as well. Before we dive into that conversation, we'd actually like to hear from you, all of the attendees. If your company is currently setting strategic goals. So we have a poll. We'll give you about 30 seconds to respond. The question is, are you currently setting strategic goals for your company? The answers could be yes, no, you're thinking about it and want to learn more. Great reason to be here. And you're not sure because it's just not your responsibility. All right. So it looks like the majority are currently setting strategic goals for your company. Makes a lot of sense for you to be here then. And then just a few who are not, some who are thinking about it, and some who aren't sure. Great. So glad that you can be part of today's conversation. So let's dive into that conversation. Josh, the goal setting process was really a result of your materiality process. And this time you really decided to use a data-driven approach to support that with DataMoran. What did that materiality process look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's completely right that this time around, we really tried to do a data-driven process, one that was replicable and highly quantifiable and reliable, and using DataMoran for that was immensely helpful. Our general materiality process followed 4 steps. First, we assessed our previous material topics from previous materiality assessments and sort of updated them, or in some cases changed them significantly, introduced new ones, combined previous ones to more accurately represent our company at this point in time. Then after assessing, we identified the stakeholders that we wanted to engage, being people as well as institutions, regulation, and also having some variation by region so that we could get nuanced regional views. DataMoran helped us inform that part as well, especially the indirect stakeholders. Then we actually went out and engaged stakeholders, be that through DataMoran module work, or through survey work in multiple languages, or through, in some cases, direct interviews. And then once all those things happened, we built our model, which is to say our models with the outputs. And that was essentially using DataMoran data as well as stakeholder input, as well as our own research and all of that folding in to turn our material topics into materiality matrices.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's essentially the quick 30-second description of our materiality process. And then once that was done, we were able to assess our end result. And right then, coincidentally, we happened to be developing our 2030 goals. So it was a really great opportunity for us to ensure alignment between our goals and our material sustainability matrix, globally speaking, as our goals are for our global company. So that is what we got to do there. And that was, yeah, really great. I think it was very helpful to have a visual guide as we were setting, our next decade's worth of sustainability goals.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And while you were speaking, I just pulled up your materiality white paper for everyone to reference. We'll send that through to everyone over email, but this is the materiality matrix that you were referencing, the global one. And to your point about being able to inform goal setting through the materiality process, could you give us an example of a specific goal that you set for the company as a result of this process?
Sure, yeah. So to take the global matrix that's viewable right now, the results of this matrix, they don't imply that if something is low internally and externally, or low in terms of impact and influence, that it is not significant to the company. What that would indicate to us is that there's a lower level of understanding around the topic, and it's still something that we would want to manage as effectively as possible. So biodiversity is our sort of bottom indicator there. So what we did for biodiversity when developing our 2030 sustainability goal was we acknowledged that maybe our stakeholders and current regulatory status and all these other inputs to the model, maybe they are currently one way, but they might be another in the future. So our goal is to essentially set an informed target by the year 2025. We want to really develop a good baseline, a good internal methodology for how the company approaches biodiversity, based on science. And once we have that understanding, we're going to actually roll out a more formal action-based goal for biodiversity by 2025. And then, so that's like, for example, that's like a bottom one where we're trying to build to effective management or more effective management. And then if we take something that's clearly very important, like climate change, that is way up there, that's one of the higher ones. So for that, we already know, and our stakeholders know, and regulations know, everyone knows basically that action is highly needed. So what we did there was, again, trying to base everything we do on science. We developed science-based targets with the Science-Based Targets Initiative for our greenhouse gas reduction goal, which is a 50% absolute reduction in scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030, which is in line with the 1.5 degree global warming limiting scenario from the IPCC. And we also, related to that, have a scope 3 science-based target of a 30% absolute reduction by 2030 as well. So essentially, this visual helped us realize the scope of our goals that were needed, where we need to build understanding and where we need to make decisive actions.
That's great. And, I think it's really important that you emphasized an issue like biodiversity that appears lower on the spectrum. That doesn't mean that the issue isn't important to the company, right? Ultimately, it's a strategic decision to determine what is important for the company based on, what the world needs, what society needs, but also, the impact that you can have. So
everything
I think,
here needs to be managed.
Yeah.
Everything here is important to our company. And then the question is, how are we managing and in what way? And that materiality process helped us inform that decision making.
That's great. Yeah, and Julie, the goals that you set are quite transformational, and it's very rare to see transformational goals set. I think companies set realistic goals, but transformational goals are bold. So, what I find really fascinating is that you actually had the different executive management, the different presidents of the company, as well as the board, really involved in the process of not only determining goals, but owning these goals. So could you just talk a little bit about what that looked like?
Sure. Yeah, so for us, it was about setting goals that the world needs, not what we could actually do. We knew we could do today, which is a challenge. It really stretched us and forced us to think differently. So as we were setting the goals as an organization, as a sustainability organization, we looked and said, what is the expectation on the world today? Where do we need to go? We really developed that strategy around the goals of where we were expecting to move as a company, where we needed to move, and then took it to the board and the presidents and the business leaders and said, for certain subjects, for example, on combating climate change, we would say for our foam business, our blowing agent is required to significantly change to meet the goals. So in our sustainability report, we actually outline the top focus areas of the company, and each one of those have specific business owners that are accountable to deliver these goals, and they actually have in their own talent center profile goals related to that. So they are accountable to deliver on the goals and to force them within the organization for the change that's necessary. In some instances, to actually start innovation on topics that we don't know how to manage today around circular economy or 100% waste reduction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, I'm looking at the Q&A here, not sure if you could see that on my screen, but there's actually a question about the company's process, enterprise risk management. Did that influence the goals at all, or the way that you engage with senior management and the board?
So the process is engaged. They're involved. We have a direct line of sight and communication with them.
Mm-hmm.
So if something is showing up in our materiality process, we do have a conversation with to say, is it showing up on your side as well? And I will say, individuals from sustainability, the CSO, as well as some other individuals are actually embedded in the process to ensure that they're connected as well. So it's a back and forth process. Obviously, they kind of push against each other, and there's impact on both sides. So really understanding the risk from their side as well as our side and saying, do they align?
Yeah. Yeah, that's very important. I think what we're seeing now is there's a maturity, right, happening at companies, and enterprise risk management and sustainability experts are working much more hand in hand. So that's exciting to see as well, and I think the next question is also, getting finance involved in that conversation, but it seems like you had finance involved in that conversation as well.
That's correct. Yes, they are from areas related to carbon trading, right? So it goes across the entire thing. Cost of waste, for example, for us, cost of waste isn't just the cost to put it in the landfill. It's the cost to produce the raw material, to the cost to actually manufacture a product that would end up in the landfill, right? So it's the entire cost portfolio. So finance is involved in almost all of these topics.
That's great. And I think to your point about really putting an emphasis on wanting to use a data-driven approach, a science-based approach, one thing that you also did, which I think is quite unique, is you had an external assurance engagement, not just on the underlying data, but on the entire materiality process. And that was provided by an external assurance provider, SGS. So just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that looked like as well.
Yeah, I can start with that. It was actually SCS. SGS is another one. But anyways, yeah, it's a good practice, we think, probably one that we would expect to see more of in the future from materiality assessments. And yeah, to assure your materiality process, it takes quite a bit of planning ahead of time. Probably the first thing to do when you know that you're going to be doing a new materiality assessment is to determine exactly what standards you are consulting with and what the scope is of your assessment. So from the very beginning, we needed to know, well, we want to do the GRI materiality standard. We want to meet that. And we also wanted to meet the AA 1000 accounting principles materiality standards. So those were our two scopes. And we also knew, of course, that we wanted to do the 3 sub-regions that are material to our business, as well as a global view. So all of those things needed to be established ahead of time. And then when it came time for the actual assurance process to discuss or to review our work, what we had developed was a very detailed process document. And the white paper is kind of like the process document, but like 20% of it, So It was very helpful for the assurance process and for our own knowledge when we go back and when we refresh this assessment and so on, to have a very detailed notes behind not only like the initial scope and the assumptions, but the actual nuts and bolts of how we take our data and DataMoran data and turn it into these visuals, and how we develop our stakeholders, how we develop the scopes of our material topics, who's involved, in what way. And to get all of that on paper is crucial for an assurance process.
I think the other thing we should say about the assurance process is our Assure SCS was actually able to use DataMoran directly. They interacted directly with the DataMoran professionals, had questions, reviewed those questions directly through the tool as well as through that interaction. And I would say that for us, that relationship with the DataMoran professionals is a key to the relationship as well as the tool. It's one that we don't take for granted, and we know that it's not always available with every tool, but one that we realize it allowed us to really use DataMoran in a different way, and to really capitalize on the opportunity of using the tool within our process.
That's great to hear. Thanks for mentioning that. Great. You know, I think this has been a really good setup, and there was actually a question regarding, you know, the qualitative scores of materiality. I think when we get through the live workshop portion of this, or the demonstration, we can talk through that process as well. But before we do, we have another question for the attendees. So another poll. And we're just curious to hear from you, for those that have gone through the process of setting strategic goals, which we've heard from Julie and Josh is quite comprehensive. What's the biggest pain point in setting strategic goals? So the different answers here are being confident in the source of information guiding that process, the data collection, whether that be both internal data collection or external data collection, establishing a realistic time frame, gaining buy-in from senior leaders and the board, and other. Explain that in the chat box, please, if you have an other. So I'll give you a couple more seconds to respond. Okay, so it looks like data collection, being confident in the source of information guiding that process, and gaining buy-in from senior leaders and the board. So that's exactly what we're talking about today. We're focusing on those three key things. So it's good to hear. All right. So now we're going to move into a more hands-on live demonstration of the process essentially that Julie and Josh went through using DataMoran to support materiality, but then also to help inform goal setting. Just to make it clear, today we're using a sample analysis. So the materiality results that you see in Owens Corning's report and the materiality white paper will look different from what you see here today, but this is just a sample based on real external data to give you an idea of what that process looks like. So I've now logged into DataMoran, and DataMoran can give you a variety of external stakeholder perspectives. Key perspectives are corporates. So what are the priority issues of other companies? The next perspective is really regulation, but also standard setters, policymakers. So what are the issues that are really included within hard law? And what are the issues that we see starting to pop up in, you know, softer framework standards, things like the Sustainable Development Goals, GRI, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And then the third piece is really more focused on reputation, and this is looking at both international news as well as social media as inputs. So here with DataMoran, you can dive into each of those sources to really get deep, but the foundation of everything that you do is the analysis feature that we're going to focus on for today. So for today, I just built out, as I'd mentioned, 2 sample analyses looking at the industrials industry broadly. We're going to start with the one called custom topic mapping, and we're going to start with the outputs so you can see what the results look like, and then we'll work backwards so you can see how we actually got to that process, and Julie and Josh will be the ones really leading that conversation to explain how they went through that process. So if I click on the results, what we'll see is something that we were just looking at is a matrix view. Again, this is a sample. Here, essentially, the vertical axes, the external view, is giving you an indication as to what are the priority issues of those different external stakeholders accessible through DataMoran that I just spoke to. So this is based on real data. And then the internal view, what we see here for the horizontal axes, is just an example of what could be representative of the priorities of the company. So different ways that you can populate that through DataMoran. You can use surveys, there are interactive tools as well, but just to give you an idea of what a result looks like. Now, the more interesting, I would say, part really is when you look at this table view, because this is where you can get down to the details, right? This is where you can start to look at the data and really understand what is driving exactly what you see in that image in the matrix. So this is, again, giving you an idea of the process Julie and Josh went through. What we can see here is there are about, 26 different issues that cover about 90 different topics that we track in DataMoran. And what you're able to see here is not only, what is the relative priority of each of these issues according to all of the different external stakeholders, but you can really understand what are the priority issues of each of the different stakeholders. And that's exactly what these different columns represent. So the first column that we're looking at are essentially ESG or sustainability reports published by industrial companies globally. The second view that we look at is the financial reports, including SEC filings of companies in the industrials industry published in 2020. Then we're looking at a specific group of peers. So from the larger sector to, let's say, 10 peers. Then we look at mandatory regulation, voluntary regulation, again, being those softer norms, framework, standards, policies. We look at news, social media, and then here is an example of how you could add in, a different custom view. So Josh and Julie, you actually did some surveys with other external stakeholders, including your customers. So this is just, again, a sample to give you a view of how you can actually integrate the DataMoran insights with some of those more custom insights as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. So we used pretty much every one of these columns in a capacity for each of our assessments. So yeah, this view of like mandatory regulation, voluntary regulation, social and news flow, these were all very valuable in their own context. Like even before they become a visual in DataMoran, this data was a big part of our process. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting here is that you can actually contrast and compare and see very clearly how, for instance, voluntary regulation is very much an indicator of emerging issues. If we look at, what are the top 5 issues for the industrials industry worldwide based on voluntary regulation, we can see that that differs quite significantly from, what we see in mandatory regulation. It differs from what we see within corporate reports as well. So, we often look at voluntary regulation, news, and social media as sort of societal signals through DataMoran, because this gives you an indicator of what has not yet fully become institutionalized, not yet reflected in hard law, not yet reflected in reporting, but really an indicator of what's coming down the pike. So through this view, you can essentially contrast and compare. But also, this answers one of the questions we saw earlier about the qualitative scoring. There's something to keep into mind here as well. You can actually provide, customizable weights to each of these different stakeholders, and that will ultimately help to inform the total external score, which essentially is just an average of the scores across each of these sources, and it takes into account the weighting. And I know that's something that you worked with as well, Josh and Julie, through DataMoran.
Yeah, we played around with the weighting a bit. When we did our materiality matrices, we looked at the ways that we could visually represent these. And we ended up going with a impact and influence axis, which varies slightly from internal external. And when we did that, because this is so parceled out here in a way where you can get the individual numbers behind these columns, we ended up sort of rerouting some of the columns, plugging what's vertical into what's horizontal and so on. And thankfully, we were able to do that pretty effectively because DataMoran can export data to such a minute level. So that was helpful for us when building our matrices.
This is Julie. I'll also say that those columns on voluntary, social, news, we've used those outside of the materiality process to really understand impacts of certain topics that we're looking at Owens Corning, to understand what's happening in our sector and what's happening in the world, how our peers or how organizations or individuals are really looking at certain topics. It's been really beneficial for us as a quick check understanding of what's out there. And is there anything that we need to understand differently or look at differently within the organization?
Yeah, that's very true. And also DataMoran is immensely helpful as just a peer searching tool. We use it all the time for that. So for materiality, we put in our industry and we put in our peer lists of key customers and key suppliers and key competitors. But we also use it regularly, the search module, just to do keyword searches and find, okay, who's disclosing on this particular aspect, who's using this approach in this exact way. And then when we find those companies, that really helps us research best practices and make recommendations for ourselves. So it's really helpful, and it really helps us develop pathways within our sustainability goals to actually make the changes needed to realize them. So DataMoran has a value even beyond just creating the materiality matrix, because it also helps us sort of actionize it, if that's a word.
Well, I like it. If it's not a word, actionize it, operationalize it, right? Because I think that's always a big challenge.
Yeah.
Once you have this information, how do you actually operationalize it? So while you were speaking to that search feature, just pulled up an example of how you can use that as well. Yeah. Great. Well, I think now that we've seen what an output could look like, I know that's not where you started with DataMoran. So would love to just talk through that process with you, how you actually got started, how you set this up. And then, as a next step, now that you've set these materiality matrices, now that you've set these goals, what's next? But when we started, you said you sort of looked across every single DataMoran topic as a starting point before you actually map them into those broader issues. So I built out an example just to showcase what that looks like. And then we can actually talk through, how you set up the criteria to inform that analysis. But here we're now looking at a different example where clearly the materiality matrix is not complete. It's also quite busy because we have 90 topics plotted across the external viewpoints. But here, just to give you an example, essentially this can be a starting point, as it was for you, Josh and Julie, where we look across every single, topic that DataMoran tracks. And let me zoom in, that might be a bit tricky for everyone to read. So as you can see, it covers traditional ES&G issues, but also geopolitical issues, technology issues, emerging issues. A good example is, public health risks is a topic that is now a standalone topic that we track, obviously in light of epidemics and pandemics that we're facing. But if you could just explain, how did this get you at a good starting point, and then what was the process from there?
Yeah, the DataMoran subtopic list is really important because it's very inclusive. It references basically the full gamut of business risks and opportunities and how they could materialize. So there's really no way for us to know that we thought of everything if we don't have what you would consider to be like an exhaustive list to check off against. So yeah, we ran an initial assessment just on every subtopic without naming them and organizing them and weighting them, just everything. So that way we could see what is naturally flagging high for our settings and what is naturally flagging low, and was that on our radar? Was it not? is there a disconnect between the company and the industry, and does that make sense, or is that something that we need to address and change the scope of our material topics? So that was sort of a step one. Also a step one, similarly, using DataMoran before really using the materiality module, was we also ran our old report. We ran our 2018 sustainability report basically against what we thought we were disclosing on, and we saw, what is coming up as highly disclosed upon, what is coming up as low, and that helped us understand sort of if our reporting itself needed a bit of a tweak, and that helped inform our following report, in which we talked about our new material topics. So there's a lot of ways to sort of use DataMoran in a preparatory and in a pre-check manner. And then what we, another thing that we would do then is we sort of made our internal decisions about these subtopics and, which ones matter to us and our logic on that, but we weren't necessarily certain that we had the right approach. So that was one instance where we got to utilize like DataMoran's physical people and reached out to our contacts and said, do you agree with this? Does this make sense to you? Does our approach, do you recommend anything different? And in many cases, they would suggest, here's how I would run that. Here's what I would do. Sometimes they were even like, oh, I ran this for you. Here you go. So it was very helpful to have that support through the process. And that even was sort of like a formal step in our methodology to like seek feedback that we're using this tool correctly from the subject matter experts. And then basically once we went through these individual subtopics and once we went through our internal and external subject matter expert discussions around the scopes of our material topics, that was when we were able to start rolling them into our material topics. And then that allowed us to know that we were accurately representing our material topics within the DataMoran subtopics, which of course is what leads to having effective DataMoran data informing our materiality matrix. Might have rambled a bit there, but hopefully that gets at some of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's important to your point, right? So, I think a key challenge is for most companies, what do I know is relevant for the company and how do I prove that, right? So how do I get data to validate what I know? Because I think traditionally, especially when it comes to sustainability or ESG issues, processes have relied quite a bit on subjective opinion or, manual desktop research, which can be limiting simply because of the scope of information that we as humans can analyze, interpret, and understand. So one, it's about validating what you know, but to your point, Josh, it's also about being able to look beyond and sort of pick up on those potential blind spots, or even just reinforce, I know this is an emerging issue. How do I prove that to board members, to other presidents, to get them to be bought into the process of taking ownership of those issues? Yeah,
we really tried to take ourselves and our opinions out of this process as much as possible. It's not, you can't do that 100% just realistically, but everywhere where we possibly could, that's what we really endeavored to do. And this like regimented approach, this measurable approach with DataMoran definitely helped us to realize that.
And I think the same thing came with the goals as well, taking our what can we do out of it and more about what does the science need us to do was one of our approaches. So could we use science-based targets for climate change goal? Can we use a waste goal based on methodology expected for our industry? So really taking what our own expectations are, our approach, or even our results to date out of the conversation and really into where do we really need to be. And I think we could really use DataMoran to drive that conversation because we could get to information which we previously weren't able to get to in our old approach.
Yeah, and let's actually talk through that process of getting to that information that maybe you couldn't get to otherwise. We've seen the results, we've seen the outputs, but what's actually informing that analysis? So essentially what we're looking at now here is the process that you are in complete control of as a user. Obviously, our team is here to support you, as Josh has mentioned. But essentially, how do I know that I'm looking at information that's relevant for my business? So what you see in those columns that we were looking at earlier is what you can build out here. And the first viewpoint, there are 4 viewpoints in DataMoran, but you can also add in custom data. The first viewpoint is the corporate view. So just to give you an example of what that looks like, here you can essentially create up to 5 different benchmarks, as we call them, or different corporate views. So Josh and Julie, I know you started off just looking broadly at your sector. So, here, building products and components, that's your sector. But, I added in construction and engineering just to give an indication of how, you can mix and match. A lot of companies, I think, operate sometimes across various sectors, and that can be quite challenging, right? From a benchmarking perspective, how do you look across all these sectors? So just to give an example of what that looks like. I separated here the sustainability reports and financial reports because I think a new concept that a lot of companies are starting to think about is double materiality. Essentially, what do we see as already financially material versus material from an ESG perspective? So that was the second benchmark that we built in for today's sample. And then the third, if you don't want to look across the sector, you can look across specific companies. And we track about 8,000 companies globally. Josh and Julie, I think you had added some additional benchmarks, if I'm not mistaken. For instance, best in class was a viewpoint that you looked at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the way that I believe we factored that in was when we selected our sectors, that would be consistent between our global and our regional matrices, and countries would vary based on global or which area we're specifically looking at for our visual. Companies was the way, and peer lists, which would translate to companies, were the way that we factored in certain types of companies that we would consider to be best in class, or that we would consider to be key suppliers or key customers. That was a way to ensure that all of their inputs and all of their reporting values were incorporated into our assessment. So yeah, it was helpful to do it that way, certainly.
Yeah. So just an example, if you wanted to create this new best in class, not sure if you remember which companies you looked at, or if you want to talk about that, you can just pull, some random darlings of the ESG world.
Yeah, that might be best, because I couldn't say that I have it off the top.
So let's pick a Unilever. Let's pick a PG&E, or not PG&E, it's P&G. Excuse me, as I'm Procter & Gamble, just to give you an example of how you can build that out, and I'll save that.
We also did the same with our customers as well as our competitors. So we really used not just the peer, but we used our suppliers and our customers too. And it helped us understand what is the expectation from our supplier lens and what's the expectation from our customer lens. If you think from the customer side, our composites business is more B2B. So we're selling to another business who's selling to the end customer. So it's really important for us to understand from a customer lens on their side, what do they need? What do they want? Where are they going? Because we need to be able to support their sustainability journey as well. So,
yeah.
Yeah, and actually, just thinking on it a little more, I believe the way that we actually built our best-in-class list was through DataMoran. I think we went to benchmark, and I believe I selected one DataMoran topic that matched closely to environment, one that matched closely to social, and one that matched closely to governance. And then what we did was we essentially selected, our whole industry, every company that factors within there, and looked at which reports were flagged as reporting on high for all 3 of them, or high and medium and high, like a good level of disclosure around those 3. And we used that to essentially have a list of, I don't know, maybe 20 companies or 30, where we then went straight to their reporting, to their materiality assessments, and looked at them and said, okay, what are these companies doing that are doing a good job, that are disclosing well? How are they approaching materiality? And that was a big part of our initial process, when we were still thinking about design and how we want to do it. That was a big step. So yes, the best in class made it into the materiality module, but it was also very important for us from like an initial topic determination and scope determination standpoint as well.
Yeah, I don't think we have time to show benchmark today, but that's a good point. This is really where we focus on the corporate reporting landscape, so you can really zoom in and do topic specific, to your point, Josh, analyses. So that's great. That's great to hear that DataMoran helped you to set up that best in class list as well.
Mm.
Yeah, and then, the next points are, essentially going through similar filters, but now we're looking at regulation. So to your point, you had your global analysis, but then your regional analysis. So here we're looking at your sectors globally, but for the regional analyses, essentially what you did was just to edit the country view and focus, for instance, just on the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Yeah.
And then not changing much besides that between the individual assessments allowed us to know that we were having, highly comparable results. And the only thing we were changing was the regional scope. So that is what enabled us to confidently create our regional results and know that they were, apples to apples.
Great. Yeah. Comparability. That can be a challenge. So it's important to have that. Great. And then just quickly, on the news and social media, here you took an industry-wide view, I believe, when looking at the news.
Yes.
Yeah.
I believe that things might have been a little different in the news module back when we did this, but we did whatever we could. I think we did industrials, I believe was the industry, and I believe we also did global news as the scope because news is news anywhere.
And for purposes of these analyses, we'll look at just the last 6 months of news data to make sure it's really relevant and up to date, but you have the news module here where you can look more historically as well. I mean, you'll just see, total number of news articles included in the analysis. And then social is really just a general high-level proxy of public opinion. So this is where we look at Twitter, and we just look across generally, no specific industry streams. You can see total number of tweets from the last 6 months as well. Yeah, and then, that's essentially the foundation that you can start with. But as we saw in the earlier analysis, you can also add in some custom data. So if you do engage with other stakeholders through other means, you can essentially include that here. But that's really the process you went through, Josh and Julie, as a starting point. And then, as you said, you did some more, surveys and actually did surveys in other languages as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the platform's just crunching the data to update the view. Again, we're looking not at the fully populated view because we're looking across all DataMoran topics now. So internal is not yet populated, but there are ways to do that through DataMoran, which I won't go into today. And then here again is where you can see, that added view, that added benchmark that we pulled in, just looking at 2 companies in this instance. So quite limited, but just to give an example. All right, well, I think before we get to the questions, the next step for you now, where you really are in your journey, is refreshing this view of materiality, but also monitoring these issues and the goals that you set that are tied to these issues. So that's something that we're going to start working on together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to your point, when we were talking in preparation for this meeting, Julie, you said something about, you really, and you've said it here too, it's about knowing what society needs, right? And having the data to prove that. So for you, the materiality refresh and monitoring, you were mentioning that that's a way to sort of keep track of how societal needs are changing.
Sorry, go ahead, Julie.
I was going to say that's correct. I think as a company, we're trying to make sure that as the world moves and as the expectations on companies evolve, we continue to look at it to understand where we need to be as an organization, and if we need to change our materiality, alter it, or add anything to it, for example, going forward. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, that's all right. And also, like, from the first step, we knew that having our assessments through DataMoran enabled like one-click updating. So that was a big part of our consideration. And, when we plan to refresh our materiality assessment, we did it last year, so the refresh would be this year for the first time. That was always on our radar. The monitoring module is newer. I believe it sort of came out right as we finished. So, great, we're going to roll that in too. But, it was always sort of a part of DataMoran's value to us is that it's so, easy to have consistent yearly updates considered.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can essentially just clone the analysis we looked at and then refresh the data. But to your point, this is one of the newer features that we launched this year, obviously responding to the fact that things are changing rapidly. So how do you keep track of what's changing? But more importantly, how do you know what's actually driving that change? Because I think that's a big challenge. So essentially, what we'll start using now is this feature where you can see, for instance, something like transition to a circular economy is an issue that's increased in ranking over the past 6 months. And what's really driven that change is actually corporate reporting. So we can see that this is becoming a more important issue for other companies in your industry. And they're actually reporting on that, not just within their sustainability reports, but also their financial reports. And then we can see issues, a kind of cross spectrum, digital privacy and security, employee well-being and health, something that's really driven by both voluntary regulation as well as social media, where something like systemic disasters and geopolitical events, which covers public health risks, things like epidemics and pandemics, we can see obviously regulators are responding now to that and picking up the pace. So this just gives you a view of how you can monitor how issues change, but also know exactly what is driving that change. And this is not just about what has increased the most in importance, but it's also about what has potentially decreased in importance and what's made that change as well. And for all of these views, you can, pull out a graph to use for presentation purposes as well. All right, well, we have about 5 more minutes. I want to just double check the Q&A. Apologies that I wasn't monitoring that during the discussion. Let me just exit this full screen view, pull up that Q&A. All right, let's see the questions that we might be having. We've already answered to. So Sion, I hope we got to the background on how we got to the relevance of those quantitative scores. We talked about the ERM process. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to type those in. But we actually have one final question for you, the attendees. And that question, in the form of a poll, is, does your board review progress towards your strategic goals? So not only are they involved in approving that goals, but do they review progress towards those strategic goals? And the answers are no, yes, just starting to, or I'm not sure. And it looks like out of the responses we've gotten so far, the majority are saying yes, which is great. Great. Yeah, and I think reviewing progress towards goals, that can be a challenge, right? Because I think as companies, we're always so results driven. But Julie, you were mentioning, it's not just about the end result and the KPIs, it's also about the projects that help you make that progress. And that's something that you're focusing on now at Owens Corning as well.
Yeah, so if we go into the question about, does the board review progress to the goals? One thing I want to mention is, we really try at Owens Corning to not just where are we against the 100% renewable electricity goal, but really what are those projects that get us to that 100% goal. So the board may hear about those projects, hear about those milestones to get to that goal, not necessarily the goal itself on an ongoing basis, because our goals are a 10-year period and it's going to take time, and it really has to be a strategic approach over time to meet these large-scale goals. So part of our review with the board is really directly in line with those projects, which may be a change in a blowing agent or maybe waste projects around the globe that really drive the overall program, but it's a step-by-step phased approach to getting to those goals.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a journey.
Right.
And every part of that journey is a step towards more maturity and more progress. And we at DataMoran are extremely humbled and thrilled to be part of your journey.
Thank you.
And just to add a little bit, I think a lot of the necessity of having like corporate tie-in to our goals relates to the fact that we're setting goals that are larger than what we can simply accomplish because they're based on what the world needs. So We're not saying, oh, what would have happened anyways as a result of business as usual? Let's call that a goal and let's meet that goal easily. The goals that we're setting require serious business change, and the only way that those can happen is if you have serious business alignment. So that would be sort of the value of having the, support at the highest levels for your sustainability goals, because it does require, systemic changes to the whole company to realize them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Got to take action now. Great. Well, really appreciate you taking the time today. I've learned a lot, again, talking through the process. For everyone who's joined us today, thank you. I appreciate your questions. We'll actually send a follow-up, including the materiality white paper that Owens Corning published, so you have quick access to that, but you can easily Google it and find it online. We'll also include Julie and Josh's email, so you can reach out to them directly if you have any questions. Any questions about DataMoran and that process, we're available to respond as well. But we hope we got to answer all your questions, provided some good insight that you can now take away and actionize or operationalize within your own companies. And look forward to continuing that discussion on each of your journeys. So thanks, Josh and Julie.
Thank
you. Have a
you.
good rest of the day.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be in touch.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Bye.
Bye.
Raise their hand. Thanks.